Excellent. So, hello everyone. My name is Agnes Bala, and I will be monitoring today's session today. Thank you so much for joining us. Today's conversation will explore an important question. Now that many jurisdictions have moved beyond moved beyond the question of legalization, how do we design cannabis policy that truly promotes public health, repairs harms, and serves communities? We're fortunate to be joined by two outstanding experts who bring complementary perspective from public health and law. Let me introduce our speakers for today. It is my pleasure to introduce Meredith McGee, public health researcher at the Parabola Center for Law and Policy. Meredith leads qualitative research on cannabis legalization in partnership with Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Her work focuses on understanding how legalization is experienced by communities and how policy can better prioritize public health. She holds a master's degree uh, a master's degree in public health from Yale School of Public Health and regularly writes about regulated industry and public policy. Joining Meredith is Professor Douglas Berman, the chair in law and executive director of the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center at The Ohio State University's Moritz College of Law. Professor Berman is nationally recognized for his scholarship on criminal law, sentencing, and drug policy, and brings decades of experience to questions surrounding cannabis reform and justice. We're delighted to have both speakers join us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Meredith to begin today's presentation. The floor is yours.
Hi everyone, can you all see my screen right now? And you can all hear me. So thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm super excited to be here and super excited to talk about the upcoming research that Parabola Center for Law and Policy is publishing. We have spent the past year designing, developing, recruiting, and interviewing participants, and I'm so ecstatic to finally be able to share our findings. So diving in quite quickly, our research study was a qualitative research study focused on semi-structured interviews. Overall, we had 37 people interviewed, and that covered 9 mature markets. We defined a mature market as a state that had 5 or more years of adult use sales at the time. This was at the time of IRB approval, so it was November of 2025, which means that we lost a couple of states that have recently become 5 years. I've had a lot of people from New York and New Jersey ask me about it, and I'm like, I'm so sorry. The IRB approval was quite early. But that did leave us with 9 states, one of which being Illinois. And otherwise, we had Massachusetts, California, Alaska, Oregon, Nevada, Michigan, Washington, and Colorado. So these states are very distinct and different from each other. And we wanted to understand how these different policy landscapes really impacted the consumer experience. And this study really aimed to capture the experience of a typical cannabis consumer. We didn't want someone who went to the dispensary every day and knew everything to know about cannabis. We also wanted to make sure it wasn't someone in the industry or someone that had advocacy ties as well. So we really are trying to get the like regular Joe Schmo of people who participate in the cannabis industry. We recruited primarily through social media like Reddit. We also reached out to community organizations, health centers, and referrals through our own networks. And eligibility criteria was quite broad with if you were 21 plus, if you had shopped in a dispensary or knew someone who shopped at a dispensary in a mature market, you were pretty much eligible, except if you had really extensive ties to advocacy or industry. We have a little breakdown on the right of our participants. We do have more participants in some states than the last and a couple of others, but I will say thematically, they all pretty much matched up. And a quite diverse age range here. I think our oldest participant I think she was like 87. And so we got people who were freshly 21 and participating in the market, and someone who is 87, and from when she was younger to today, it's it's a new world in cannabis. And roughly half of our participants, a little bit under than half, use cannabis daily or near daily. So while they may not be the advocates and the ties to industry people, we do see that a lot of our participants were using here and there, using pretty much daily. And overall, the demographics kind of matched up pretty closely with the census, though political ideology is one that we've really struggled with. Our sample does lean pretty liberal and moderate than conservative, though we tried as hard as we could. We did specific outreach. They weren't willing to talk to us, and that's okay. So going from there and looking at the positives of legalization, people overwhelmingly cited the fact that people are not being arrested anymore as one of the main positives. People again and again would say it's crazy that we're arresting people for this plant. It's crazy that we're spending time, money, and resources and policing it, especially when more and more states are becoming legal. They were highly knowledgeable in knowing that just because it's legalized now does not mean that everyone who was previously incarcerated gets out or that records are expunged. And every participant pretty much had a feeling that there is some sort of injustice that needs to be repaired, and that cannabis legalization has started doing so, but might not have achieved that fully. But the fact that we are no longer arresting at the rate that we did previously was seen as an overwhelming positive. People also talked extensively about a safer and regulated supply. My favorite quote of the entire study is in the bottom right-hand corner, where a participant says, I'm glad that I don't have to go to a dumpster behind Taco Bell to get weed. Again and again, participants would say, I don't have to go talk to the sketchy person. I don't have to tell my friends, oh, I'm going here to pick up something. If I don't come back, this is where I was. So many people were just excited that they could go into a store. There was a trusted source via the bud tender to talk to, and that they knew that the state was testing the supply. It was regulated, that they knew that what they were getting is what they are getting. The tested supply also led to a huge finding of cannabis consumers in mature markets are becoming more and more educated in the plant itself. So whereas you would go to your dealer and get whatever he had and it had a strain name, but you're not really sure it is that strain or the genetics of it, yet alone the THC percentage, people would say, oh, I know I react best to 22% THC, and I like strains that are heavier in CBD, or I go for edibles that have CBG. So people are becoming more and more educated and nuanced in their cannabis use patterns because of the fact that when the product is regulated and tested, they are able to have more information at their disposal to make choices that are best for their needs. Furthermore, kind of building off of the previous 2 points, is less stigma overall. People would share that going into the dispensary, they would see 50-year-olds, 20-year-olds, literally anyone under the sun in a dispensary utilizing the market, all for different reasons. People would say that they started talking to their parents about it, that they started talking to even their teenagers about it, and that the reduction of stigma has led to really beneficial, open, honest conversations about not only just the positives of cannabis, but also some of the negatives and the nuance in understanding how one can be a cannabis consumer safely and minimizing harms and risk. And as someone who uses cannabis for medical purposes, I want to highlight the last point is that in our current landscape, we have typically a medical market and a recreational market, and we think medical users are going into the medical market and recreational users are purchasing from the rec market. I want to say 70% of our interviewees cited at least one medical use of cannabis that they were buying through the recreational market, whether that was helping them sleep, helping with pain, helping with anxiety, even just using it as a way to muscle tension was a huge one. Was they were this many participants would say like, oh, it really helps when I'm sore after a workout and I can relax fully. But overwhelmingly, people were not participating in the medical market. People weren't getting their med cards, but they were going to the recreational industry to serve their medical use purposes. This isn't a new finding. Lots of studies have pointed towards the fact that people will lean into the recreational market when there is an option outside of the medical market. But again and again, these participants are kind of becoming their own like personalized doctors with cannabis and saying, oh, I use it for this, I use it for that. And that's a really untapped spot that I want to look into, because they're also telling their friends and their neighbors about these medical uses. So it's a lot of social norms being developed quite rapidly here. Now, there are good and bad, but the negative sides of legalization are really just spaces where education, transparency, things need to be a little more open for the consumer to see. A lot of concerns were where's the tax money going? We hear a lot about tax money now. Where is the benefits? A lot of people could cite maybe one or two ways that tax money was being used, but almost always they could not name explicitly what it was being used for. They would say, oh, I think I saw it in the news somewhere, or I heard it in the newspaper article. So, but then saying, I wish I knew more. I wish I had been able to look this up in an easy, accessible way. Why don't I know this? I feel silly. I shop at the dispensary, but I don't know where my money is going. However, the concern largely remained that they don't see where the money is going, that people weren't advertising, oh, this in part was helped by cannabis tax revenue. Oh, this in part was done because of this policy. They really wanted to be able to see that cannabis is benefiting their community if it was, and if it wasn't, being able to understand why it wasn't. Additionally, overregulation and consolidation. This one surprised me because I was thinking that the average consumer might not know about like the nuance of cannabis being overregulated, but a lot of consumers were. The consumers would really learn through talking to bud tenders, talking to their friends about what the larger markets are, what the smaller brands are, what's local, what's not local. And also we're very aware of any issues with if shops were closing down, or if there was a rule change that put undue stress on a certain brand or anything. They would tell me these stories, and I would ask, where did you hear this from? Or is it from a bud tender who's telling you this? And it would be from their social groups, it would be from bud tenders, but not particularly straight from the source, I guess would be the best way to say. But they are concerned about the market being free and open, and explicitly they want local family small businesses to succeed. And then finally, problematic and underage use. So we saw that a positive of legalization is increased access, but there are factors that people are concerned about, particularly underage use is a big concern. They see a lot in the news about underage use, and overall, I would say that participants would say, I hear a lot about it, but I don't know how bad it is. There were parents that we interviewed that would say, yeah, my kids say that they do it, but it's hard to tell the difference between nicotine or THC. And overwhelmingly, parents would say, I just want to talk to my kid, and I'm glad that it's legal because now I can talk to my kid at a better level. So it's a concern, but it's nothing. It's not a big overwhelming wave of people saying, yeah, I saw 10 kids went to the ER in one night. It's very much so, I've heard it through the grapevine, I've kind of seen it here and there. It's in general a concern. However, high potency products were more of the concern from our participants. Many would say that the selections were higher in potency than they expected at first. We had one participant who I think I quote later, who didn't know to cut the gummy up into pieces, and had a quite shocking experience. And that's common across the board. As a researcher, I hear it outside of this study, and it's just something that we continue to hear, is that learning about potency can be kind of a curve, and that policy might not be able to capture the right introduction into dosing, I think is the right way to put it. We had one participant who said, I know one glass of wine and one beer and one shot is equal, but when I look at the cannabis, I kind of don't know what I'm getting, and I don't know what an equivalent of like one drink in THC would be. And that is where a lot of the potency concerns are coming across. Now, looking at opportunities improvement, these consumers really want transparency and really want to have a say in the industry. They want to be able to say, hey, I directed my tax dollars to this, or I know that this tax is going specifically to my neighborhood and this tax is going to the state for this. They felt that once legalization was passed in a state, that those smaller scale decisions weren't really in their hands at all, and they weren't really able to engage in regulated cannabis policy in a way that they felt like they could make a change. But they want to, because they're the ones consuming, and they're the ones living in their community. Also, like I said previously, people really wanted to protect small and local operators. A lot of people, while not being in the industry, would say, oh, I have a friend or an acquaintance or someone who touches the industry in some way, whether that's through, oh, he makes packaging and somehow he has cannabis companies who buy from him for packaging needs. People know how broad the industry is and how it touches different aspects of the economy, and they want to protect their local and small interests. And that speaks to also how the states are also very different. They would say, I live in this state. I think I know it, and all of my neighbors know best about what is in this state. And they were really scared of, I guess, one size fits all approach to cannabis legalization. And then legal places to use. Social consumption sites are a huge aspect, and I hear a lot about it, especially I live in Massachusetts, and that's what we're working on right now. But people would say, I can buy weed, but I can't smoke it anywhere. I can buy weed and I rent an apartment. So if I go home and smoke it, it's technically a gray area because my lease says I can't have any federally illegal substances. People are overwhelmingly concerned about knowing where they can use cannabis safely, and also having a spot where they can use cannabis to meet other people, talk to other people, and also develop social norms of cannabis use. A lot of the references to potency and being scared would be, oh, I bought my product, I went home and I was by myself and I took it, and there wasn't a spot where people could be with me, where I was with friends. It really relates to set a social environment where you can set healthy social norms and grow from it. And then nearly every participant said that they want to legalize federally. Most of them cited the fact that they wanted to be able to use a credit card, but once you prompted them beyond that, they would say, well, there's a lot of difficulties when it comes to the state federal distinction that make it really difficult. We had participants who lived on islands who said that they knew how difficult it was for dispensaries to get flower in the door. We had participants who were contracted through the government, and they could not use cannabis anymore because of the federal contract, despite them living in a legal state. And they are confused on how federal and state policies intersect and how they should be using cannabis in response to those. Because we're in Illinois, I want to drop it quickly and talk about the participants there. A lot of the threads are very similar as the other ones. However, people really talked about the rural accesses inequality and talking about how that in Chicago, there might be a lot of dispensaries, but if you go into some of the more rural areas, it becomes a 30-minute plus drive. And that accessibility is a real barrier to product choice, being able to shop at different dispensaries, really understand the market well, as well as employment discrimination and issues with jobs. Oh, we had two participants share experiences in Illinois where they either could what one participant had lost a position because they said I smoke cannabis, and the employer said I'm so sorry, we can't hire you anymore. And then another participant on the other side, where they were on a hiring board, an individual shared, oh, I might smoke on the weekends, just like you might have a drink. And the hiring board internally marked him as a no. So at least in Illinois, we had some of the most frequent references of stigma not being fully erased, especially at a structural level, and trying to and frustration around that because it's a legal substance in Illinois, and they would say, oh, stigma, like I can talk to my grandma about it and she's not upset about it anymore, and that's great. But then if I were to tell my boss, oh, I went to the dispensary and had an edible this weekend, I would get in trouble, and that makes no sense. I personally don't think that's specific to the state overall, but the fact that two instances happened was really shocking to me. And also, people talked about the difference in the medical and the recreational industry. Particularly, one individual was a patient, and they decided to not renew their medical card because there was a greater variety of small business options in the recreational market, and it was their belief that that's like they wanted to shop more small businesses. So they said, why do I use a medical card? I'll just go into the recreational market and it's easier and I get to support smaller businesses. So definitely some tension between some of the recreational and medical markets, but I think that is true with any emerging industry. And overall, what I would like to end on is that there's no single consumer experience of legal cannabis. When you say, I want the average consumer, that's like 15 different people. And when you design policy for an imaginary average consumer, you're really designing policy for really no consumer. And the fact that people want to get involved, people want to get educated. There is a thirst in the people who are using cannabis to reduce harm, to increase education, to be involved in policy at a level that they were not previously able to be involved at, is something that policymakers should be utilizing. Go talk to the constituents, see what those issues are, engage with them. Don't think of it as a vice. A lot of people would say, I hate that we talk about it strictly as a vice and that we compare it to alcohol and we can compare it to tobacco all the time, because it's giving it like re-stigmatizing it as we talk about it, and that people don't want the stigma as much anymore because they want to be able to have open and honest conversations with others around it, to be able to have the least harmful cannabis use as possible, and design for the range of experiences and understand that our history impacts where we are now, but also listening to those people and how we can design policy into the future to create a market that's really unique and economically thriving. Yeah. So the full report will publish in July. I think it's July 17th is our date that we are announcing, like releasing it full, and that will be on our website. In addition, if anyone ever wants to talk to me about this, I have so much material that I can talk on, and these interviews are just so rich. I didn't even talk about like what products people are buying today, and I could, but I would love talking about this stuff. I've taken a lot of time, but I want to thank you, and yeah, feel free to contact me and anything.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Meredith. I really enjoyed your presentation. I am going to turn it now over to Doug for the second half, the second portion of our presentation here.
Thank you so much, Agnes, and thank you, Meredith, for the work, and to everybody at the Parabola Center for that important research. In many respects, it's a perfect segue into my comments, which will be a little bit shorter and without beautiful slides, but capturing both what has brought me to the cannabis space, having been a professor for many years working on criminal justice reform, and what continues to disappoint me about the cannabis space. And that is what I think was on your very first finding, that people were concerned about arrests and the harm of criminalization. I think it's important to keep emphasizing that those harms and the racial disparities that have become widely known and the broader social problems produced by, I think, marijuana criminalization in particular, but the war on drugs even more generally, has been a motivating force for reform. And we can even see this reflected in the vote totals. Most jurisdictions that have had an initiative to vote on reform needed 50% to pass. Florida actually needs 60% to pass. And, we're generally getting 55 to 60% in favor of some form of reform, legalization, medical in some settings, full recreational uh, in many number of states. And yet the data shows, especially at the time of legalization, typically it's 15, 20%, maybe 25% of persons are regular cannabis users. And so that means the majority of folks who are voting for legalization aren't doing so to legalize their use, but rather to end other people facing the criminal justice harms. And so I think it's just so very important to kind of capture and emphasize the extent to which this is not cannabis users, sort of voting in their own interest and not concerned about broader harms, or even if they are concerned about broader harms, it's a self-interested concern. No, these are a majority of citizens across the country stating that whether they use cannabis or not, they don't see it as good public policy that the harms of criminalization continue. That said, disappointingly, for a variety of reasons, we see relatively few states at the time of legalization or even in follow-up really focusing on, really investing in, really concentrating on addressing the past and still lingering harms of criminalization. I think, again, reflected very much in the work that you and the Parabola Center is doing, Meredith. When you see people talking about stigma, you see people expressing concerns about continued challenges, even in legalization environments, that's a sign that the harms are lingering, both for past folks who may or may not have had interactions with the criminal justice system, but still struggle with that stigma, but even carrying forward today. And the failure, I think, of many reforms to focus on that, or really, this is what I see writ large, the way in which the discourse pivots so quickly to, well, let's make sure the market works, or let's make sure we have regulation just right, or let's make sure, and those are important, especially when they're focused on a range of public health and inequities. Absolutely right that there needs to be a forward-looking effort to make sure the legal cannabis markets and regulation is serving the community effectively. But oftentimes it tends to be more privileged communities that are driving that conversation and that do so without having had a history of criminalization harms directly at their front door, and at the risk of racializing it too much, I've heard people say, and I think rightly so, marijuana was, in a sense, legal for white people long before we had reform. And so, not surprisingly, when reform efforts are put forward, there's just not the same kind of personal connection and personal need to focus on redressing past harms. And yet, I think that's so profoundly important and so needed. This is, again, what got me into this space, hoping for marijuana reform not just to be criminal justice reform, but for that reform to extend to the literally millions, tens of millions of folks who continue to carry criminal justice records as the product of arrests as the product of convictions of all sorts, as a product of the continuing criminal justice footprint that we see in the drug space and particularly the cannabis space, and the way in which that then gets intertwined with all sorts of other aspects of criminal justice and criminalization excesses. I mean, among the things I focus an awful lot on federal sentencing reform, and valuably the uh, Federal Sentencing Commission did a recent report looking at how many persons being sentenced for federal crimes, and typically that's not going to be low-level marijuana offenses, but how many of those persons have their sentences increased because their criminal history score is higher based on past cannabis offenses. And they were even focusing on those in states that had already legalized. And so these were folks for whom their past criminal activity wouldn't be criminal anymore. And yet they were driving up dramatically the sentences they were now getting for future wrongdoing. And that's just one of a number of ways in which the tangible impact of these prior offenses make such a big difference. Somewhat encouragingly, a number of states, Illinois being, in many respects at the forefront, have put some energy, put some emphasis on expungement, record sealing, record relief. There's lots of labels used for the idea that we need to get rid of those old convictions, allow persons to have those taken off their record so they don't continue to formally deal with the collateral consequences of that past criminal activity being on their record and being findable through background searches and all sorts of things. But unfortunately, those efforts across the country have been limited, have been thwarted by a variety of practical and social realities. We do a lot of work at the center I help run here at Ohio State. We don't have an automatic expungement system, and if folks are interested, we could talk at great length about the different ways that records can get sealed, that expungements can take place. But in Ohio, it's all petition based, and there's a fee. There's a series of challenging legal questions about when and how a record is subject to sealing or expungement. And then most important, and this is the part that I think is so profoundly significant to understand when thinking about these issues, many people, there's not good data, so I can't say most, but many people who have a cannabis record also have a variety of other criminal records, sometimes connected to the cannabis activity. So a person can have a drug paraphernalia charge. This is what happened a lot in Ohio, even if they don't have a marijuana charge, and that may not be subject to the same expungement process because it's not technically in the cannabis space. So if you have a state that's really focused on cannabis offenses, it may not pick up associated offenses that were related to that cannabis activity. Then, in addition, of course, once persons are in communities that are heavily policed and are subject to searches and a range of other kinds of surveillance based on their cannabis use, they can be picked up for a range of other activities that, again, create criminal records that may or may not be eligible for some kind of record relief. But if you're doing automatic expungement, or if you're doing a petition based that has costs for every conviction, has all sorts of complications under the law of what's eligible to get record relief, you're not going to reach folks effectively and wipe out those harms, particularly when you think about it. And we see this in the work that we do with record relief. You have individuals for whom the very act of going to court, which is typically required in these petition-based systems to try to get record relief, is itself traumatic. The court is the place of their trauma where they were subject to criminal justice interventions of all sorts that may or may not have been traumatic across a number of felt realities. And so to expect people to feel comfortable figuring out legally whether they're eligible, finding the resources to pay, sometimes it's hundreds of dollars, to pursue record relief, and then go through the time and the energy, which often can include having to take off time from work. In Ohio, you have to show up in court as part of the relief process. And so, the burdens there are profound. I will tip my institutional interest here. I've been advocating for quite a long time that there ought to be more resources invested in legal aid, in lawyer services, of which there are considerable but still scarce, to help people in these endeavors. And in fact, we've been doing some survey work of our own about our own. It's called Opportunity Port. Welcome you to look at it, especially if you know anybody in Ohio who has a eligible criminal record. We do this public service work, and so many of the people in the community say what's just valuable is to have somebody to talk to figure out whether I'm eligible, what other convictions I have besides a marijuana offense that may be eligible, and then also get connected to social services in broader ways. And this is what then will shift me to the broader community repair needs that we have here. A community that has been subject to significant drug war enforcement, significant cannabis arrests and convictions in the past, is one that is going to be scarred in various ways by this law enforcement presence that transcends just the individual by individual criminal records. And the failure to invest in community repair that can take a lot of different forms, but that I think is so essential to really truly invest in repairing the harms of the drug war, repairing the harms of cannabis over criminalization, so important. And here's where, and I know the Parabola Center has worked on these issues and has been a big part of what a number of folks have worked on in the cannabis space. One thought was, well, we ought to make it easier for people to get jobs in the cannabis industry. And there's a synergy of harm here. Many states, Ohio being one of them, exclude somebody from working in the cannabis industry if they've got a prior record, and that could be a cannabis offense. And so oftentimes persons with these historical harms that people voted to get rid of are themselves disadvantaged to be in the industry. But I think it's so important, though I very much favor and support efforts to allow especially small and a range of equity applicants to have the opportunity to be in this space, that we recognize that's not going to repair all the community harm, that there are so many other community harms, related to employment, housing, education opportunities that's so important. And I found especially interesting, and to me, I think a missed opportunity, not just by policymakers, but also by people in the cannabis industry to really lean into the way in which cannabis tax dollars are starting to be used for community repair and should be used a heck of a lot more. I think this is something that, again, it's really the focal point of my concern, that industry players quickly turn to, well, how do we make sure we're not overtaxed? And how do we make sure we're not overregulated? How do we make sure the product is accessible to people? Those are understandable concerns for businesses. But for me, it's and how do we make sure that people know we're good stewards in the community? And this product, which is historically heavily taxed to produce significant tax revenue, I hope the industry would join with other community participants in really pushing policymakers at all levels to really rededicate those monies quite significantly to the community repair and the record relief topics that I've been mentioning. Progress has been made on a lot of these fronts. We're moving forward in powerful ways, and there are fascinating stories in Illinois. Minnesota created a cannabis relief board that I think is very an important piece of thinking through how to do this effectively, which is to have infrastructure, government infrastructure that's committed to these issues. I've, in one of my academic articles, talked about creating a justice reinvestment commission where we dedicate a certain percentage of cannabis tax revenue specifically to an agency that's only job is to try to figure out how to do this repair, because I think there are real challenges in sorting through what best practices are, particularly because they're going to vary state by state, locality by locality. Certain jurisdictions, especially if there's a lot of criminal records and a need to really address those tangible consequences of cannabis criminalization, maybe they need to invest more money in record relief programs. Other communities where perhaps the harms are different, or the community itself emphasizes we'd like more money going to education. We think we'll have more young people in our community be hopeful and optimistic about their future if there are college funds created through these cannabis tax dollars or other means to help the community move forward effectively. Here's where I then get really discouraged and depressed, and sort of bring this together with the Ohio experience, and then we'll open it up for some questions or some dialogue if folks are interested. I've been quite saddened by the fact that Ohio has gone backwards on these frontiers, largely because the conversation has gone from what do the people want to what do the politicians want. Now, this is a little bit of a Ohio specific story because we have a fairly conservative General Assembly and a outgoing governor who's been oppositional to cannabis reform from the get-go. But in Ohio, back in November 2023, there was an initiative campaign, done, I think, quite thoughtfully that not only allowed citizens to vote for full legalization, which they did by a 57 to 43 margin, but earmarked the Ohio tax revenues that would come in from a special 10% excise tax, I thought incredibly thoughtfully. Specifically, the initiative wrote into the vote that little more than a third of the monies would go back to local communities without any ties to it. So they would get to decide how they wanted to use the resources, allowing different individual communities. There were some conservative communities that might want to, use it for roads and bridges or even, education against drug use. That would be allowed. But then other communities, more progressive, might take a third of that money that was coming in and use it however they see fit. Then 25% of the resources was dedicated to statewide substance abuse and education. And again, that's an important part. Valuably, I think we've seen with cannabis reform advancing that we haven't seen a huge uptick in broader substance abuse challenges, and there's reasons to be hopeful that we won't. But there still are substance abuse issues in all of our communities, and one of the things that we hear from everybody is there aren't enough treatment beds, there aren't enough resources that are readily available to people who are struggling, however they're struggling. And so the initiative dedicated 25% of the special tax revenue to that purpose. And then there was what was called the Social Equity and Jobs Fund, which was going to take almost 40% of the revenue and give it to all these other purposes. It was going to be given to the Department of Development, and their job was to study what do communities need. Is it going to be record relief? Is it going to be other criminal justice reform? Is it going to be a range of these other community investments? And they also had some earmarks for helping provide for equity licenses for the industry. And quite frustratingly, and some degree, this is a timing story. We got something of a wave election in 2024 that led everybody to overreact and think we're turning more conservative, and that fueled the Ohio General Assembly, which was able to do so because they could change the legislation as they see fit. Tellingly, they didn't repeal legalization altogether, but what they did was basically say all of those earmarks for the tax revenue, those are gone. We're just going to take all that money, put it in the general fund, use it for what we see fit. And our senator did some estimates, and I'm proud to say we were pretty accurate. Our market's not that mature yet. We're only a couple years in, and yet it's already generating over 130 million or so a year. If think of the way the percentages were that I rattled off a minute ago, an extra $30 million, going towards substance abuse purposes every year, an extra $50 million going to the repairing of the harms every year, an extra $50 million going to the local communities every year would have had a profound impact. But unfortunately, the General Assembly said, no, we'll take all that money. And disappointingly, again, I think a little bit of a reflection of our political times, though there's been some complaints, especially among public advocates, both in public health and in justice reform, the people don't really realize it, right? That's again where Meredith's data highlights as well. People have kind of a vague sense of this. My guess is most Ohioans would say, yeah, I know they messed around with things, but at least I can still go to my dispensary and get what products I want. And so all of that just sort of contributes to what is a disconcerting, but I don't think inevitable political story that without advocates and people who are very passionate in this space continuing to emphasize the importance of these social justice issues, it's inevitable that, what are they selling at the dispensary? What stores are nearby? Some of the business components, and to some degree the public health components. I mean, I think that's another layer of interesting in Meredith's results, and is rightly a part of what's on people's minds. Tellingly, every time a bunch of gummies show up at a middle school, we're going to get 3 news reports about how a couple kids were sent to the hospital, and look what's happening. Gummies are getting into the schools. We don't see reports about look at all these people who have criminal records who don't even know that they can get their record sealed or expunged, but don't have the resources or means to readily do that. We don't get those persistent, lingering harms, subject to the kind of public discourse that would, I think, help advance reforms that are still needed. And here's where I'll come back to the depressing realities. And it's because the harms, both past and continuing, are disproportionately weighed on marginalized populations that have the least political opportunity to have their voices heard, right? And, my hope and expectation is the folks who are signing into a webinar like this are eager to make a difference this way, but it is part of, why, I feel fortunate to have a job where I can proselytize in these settings and others, because at the end of the day, the folks who are struggling with these harms don't have the time to go down to the state house or courthouse or wherever it is to make sure that people are paying attention in the way that I think is so critical, given that as they get a chance to vote, as the community gets a chance to weigh in, they actually care about these. That's where it gets back to where I started. The votes reflect a concern about these harms. In many respects, the votes reflect a good job by this community of emphasizing those harms and getting us to a point where we've been moving off the profound harms of the war on drugs and discovering that we can have a safe and legal market that produces benefits rather than harms for the community. But to make sure, again, that we don't forget the people uh, largely left behind is something that I'm grateful to have had a couple minutes to emphasize and say that, we're making progress, but there's a lot more work to do, and encourage all of you to recognize, even in states that are doing better than most, like Illinois and a few others, there's still time, money, and energy that needs to be invested to make sure folks aren't left behind.
Let's give it up. Well said, very well said. Thank you so much. And now we have the opportunity for questions from the audience. So you're welcome to take yourself off mute, put questions in the chat. And maybe as folks are gathering their thoughts right now, for that question, I'll jump in here with one of my own is, Doug, there's been quite a bit of movement recently on the federal front. Do you see any opportunities there for repair work to be done?
It's a great question, and I would say definitely opportunities. I'm not sure lots of good things are going to follow, but here's where I'll do two layers. One, one of the great things about federal reforms is they get to print their own money. So at some point, it's not a question of like limited resources. We often see that in Ohio, and elsewhere where they have to balance budgets. It's like, well, wait a minute, if we're going to put money into this, that's less money over here. I do think federal advocacy for work in this space, and there have definitely been Cory Booker and a few others, and it's been a part of some of the federal proposals, mostly coming from more progressive members, to have money invested in record relief and all sorts of community repair. And I think there's reasons to be hopeful that can be part of an ongoing agenda. The other part that I think, again, is where I'm eager to encourage a range of communities to press on these matters, even without getting political reforms. The biggest story of the partial rescheduling we've already had at the federal level, and ultimately what may be complete rescheduling of marijuana, is a huge tax break for cannabis companies. Now, it's not really right to call it a tax break. It would mean that cannabis businesses just get the same tax treatment as every other business. Right now, they're subject to, it's a complicated tax story, but extra taxes that are quite onerous. Um, Among the things that's possible, but I don't think is a given, is some of these businesses might even get tax refunds going back a number of years, and that's an extraordinary windfall to these businesses. And to have a campaign among cannabis consumers going into their local stores and saying, "Hey, I hope you'll earmark some of that money you might be getting back in taxes to a local expungement fair, or to, there are a number of law schools that do this work. Why don't you give to the local law school some resources to have law students help individuals in the community, probably a lot of your consumers, at the very least, put up our signs and encourage folks to take advantage of these opportunities." That's where, I'm encouraged. And I guess I want to make one last point, because I always leave this point out. The reason cannabis companies can even make as much money as they can, especially the reason that cannabis taxes produce as much resources as it does is because the price of cannabis is as high as it is largely because of the cost of criminalization for decades upon decades. Consumers got used to, in the illicit market, paying a premium because of criminalization. In many respects, the cost of actually growing weed, which is really does grow like a weed, is pretty darn cheap. If we had a perfect market, if you describe it that way, and this is what some public health people worry about, cannabis could be incredibly affordable. It's just a lot of people got used to paying, in a sense, too much for it. And that's why there's even a business opportunity here. And so I always, return back to this idea that those resources, tax resources, the profits that cannabis companies are making, are on the backs of those who have been criminalized in the past. And so to be continuing to remind folks that they owe a debt, in a sense, to the folks who suffered in this way in the past is part of what I think effective advocacy can do at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, when you walk into your dispensary and ask them, even if it's asking, what are you doing to support the efforts to repair harms, that I think can make a difference.
So, Doug, when are you coming to Chicago? And like, I have 87 and 4 projects that we're going to partner on, and all of these conversations and discussions. Seriously, I'm dying a little over here because I think you hit every single one of the things, like my greatest hits, if you will, from working in crim legal reform spaces and now cannabis spaces. So.
We're eager to partner with any and everybody that we can at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center. As I just suggested, resources, we can't print our own money, and so we're always
Yeah.
struggling with resources in a variety of ways, but we're always eager, both on the service front. You mentioned Opportunity Report. Thanks for who put that in the chat, because that's an incredible program that we've been very proud of, but is limited right now to Franklin County, Ohio. And then we actually did a statewide rollout, and then we didn't have the funding to continue to do it because it's just expensive, even as we've become expert in it. But we've also done collaborations on research as well with a variety of different players in a variety of different ways. And we do work awfully cheap, relatively speaking, and that's sort of a broader pitch to, working with universities more generally, is I think you do get a lot of bang for your buck. No shade to the Parabola Center. They do a lot with a little, I know. But that's itself part of the challenge in this space, is that, even the industry players say, well, we'd love to help support this, but we're paying this extra tax rate and we barely can make a living, and so on and so forth. I'm not sure that's always true, but it's always part of where, resources can be the constraint much more than time or energy.
Thank
But send
you.
me an email and, propose
Yeah.
things, and I will definitely ship it around to my peeps, as it were.
For sure. And Meredith, all over those local findings as well as the bigger picture. So thank you, and sorry in advance for all the emails you guys are about to receive from us.
Don't apologize. We always are excited to talk about it, or at least I am, because I, this research study can't just be one paper, one report, because it's just so rich and so many stories and experiences to learn from.
It's nuanced and complex, and it's all steeped in decades of propaganda that span the continuum, right? It's just steeped in it.
Great. What about questions from others? Anything we might have missed or you want to bring up?
I'm sorry, I don't know if it was my audio, but it was a little choppy, so I'm not quite sure what you just asked the group, Agnes.
Oh, sorry about that. I was just asking if anybody else has any questions or shout outs for anything. Please, now is the time. We've got a couple minutes left. Well, if not,
I always have stuff, but yeah,
oh,
please, other folks jump in, because I will just keep us going for like the next 3 hours, as my team can attest. Joe, take it away.
Meredith, I just had, and it's not 3 minutes worth of answer, but I'm interested in hearing more about, on the not quite finished side, the consumer's concern about small businesses maintaining a non-monopolistic kind of structure. I'm interested if that's kind of from your analysis, and you're not going to be able to answer it, but maybe we could do an email exchange, whether that's kind of a manifestation of American tendency to not like monopolies or, preference small businesses, or if it's something unique to cannabis that they see.
I'd love to email about this because
Okay.
I have so many thoughts about it, but I would say that it's a little bit of both. I think a lot of consumers have the idea that in order to operate in the legal cannabis industry, there is some man in a big hat, like some big monopoly man that had a lot of money to put into the business, just mostly because of the federal uh legislation around it. Because to be able to get a loan, you oftentimes can't go through the government because of the policy. So the consumer knows roughly what that is, and they say, oh, so they must have had a lot of money before and now they're growing a plant, and I don't know if it's going to be the best plant. And it's a little bit of them tracing that line of thought. And then I would say a lot of times they're aware that cannabis policy was run on, oh, let's run on reparations, let's help the communities that we've harmed. And they're not seeing that represented in some of the biggest companies, and they're seeing in their own community the people who were harmed by the war on drugs not having businesses or not being successful. And sometimes even I will say people talked about how the smallest businesses that were the most community driven, the most invested in by the community, were the ones that were more likely to go under or struggle, because they were focused on high quality plants, on really being invested in the community. And it's the fear that the big companies from out of state are gonna kind of push out the smaller people, the people who are of their own state, I guess is the best way to put it. I've had people from Alaska were very, very strongly for Alaskan only cannabis, and that like you have to be from Alaska to be able to grow cannabis in Alaska because of their history. And many other states followed very similar paths of saying like, no, I want a New Yorker to grow my New York weed. I want someone from Massachusetts and knows the soil in Massachusetts to be able to do that. It's both the thought of being anti-monopoly, but also knowing that they won't know what's best, like how to best grow weed in my community when they grew it somewhere else for their company at first. And people want that local business to stay local. They want that money to stay within their state, especially with the distinction with state and federal right now, because they know that if it could go elsewhere, and they want it state run, benefiting their state.
So it has to do with quality of a product as well as kind of community investment. Thank you.
Yeah,
I sent you my email address. Please, let's keep talking about this.
I will, of course.
Thank you. Thank you.
I love it. I love the continued conversations here. It's wonderful. We are at time. I really want to thank Meredith and Doug for their time today and sharing their expertise. We certainly are walking away with lots to consider here.